Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Nadia Tasleem, and I'm here with the most intriguing question, which is rise of Taliban and their likely implications for Pakistan, actually. Now, there's obviously this question or this point has been under debate, and we have to find out its answer, but of course, you have to be patient in order to get the answer. While looking at the rise of Taliban, we can see it apparently from 9/11, when US launched a war against terrorism and was able to topple the regime of Taliban back in the year 2001, to the recent rise of Taliban when they got back to power and Americans had to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan. But in order to, since the situation seems to be complex, we won't be able to comprehend the rise of Taliban and then obviously the likely impact of Taliban's rise on Pakistan without looking into different phases when they originally rose to power. There was one phase back in the year 1994 when Talibans were introduced to the world as the new leaders of Afghanistan. And then we see in this 2021 the resurgence of Taliban with their success against the American troops and their NATO allies and many other factions struggling to retain power here in Afghanistan. So we have to look into all these things, obviously, in order to find out, in order to comprehend this complex question or this complex topic. We need to come up with different episodes to address this question. So we would be dealing with different questions in each episode that we would be bringing for you. The first episode, that is today's episode, will be about who the Taliban are. Then the next episode would be about the rise of Taliban to power in Afghanistan back in the year 1994, when they originally were known to the world and to the Afghans, actually. Then we would be addressing why these Talibans had to face the global war against terrorism, what kind of interest Americans had in this particular zone, in this particular region, and how their government ultimately fell. The next episode would be about their struggle against America, which led them to emerge as a strong force and ultimately enabled them to get back the territory of Afghanistan that they lost 2 decades ago. By looking into all these things, in the last episode, we would be able to talk about the likely impact of Taliban's revival on Pakistan. So you have to be with us, and you'll have to follow all these episodes in order to get the answer, in order to comprehend this topic in maybe the best possible manner. Today's episode, as I've already said, would be about the question who, means who the Talibans are. But even this question, who, isn't that simple. In order to find out the answer to this question, we have to look back into the historical background. But while talking about the whole episode and while talking about while addressing this who question, we have to focus primarily on the books being produced by one of the most renowned author or one of the most renowned journalists, Ahmed Rashid, who has worked thoroughly on this particular topic of Taliban and has come up with different line of arguments and has come up with different sort of works about Taliban. So I've just brought into your notice 2 of his most promising books on the same topic. One is Taliban, the story of the Afghan warlords by Ahmed Rashid, and the other is Taliban, and it's the bestseller. It's in context of the security, fragile security situations, and even rising Islamic ideas in Afghanistan and all these things. But as I told you, that we have to go back into history quickly in order to see who Talibans are. So we see that the rise of Taliban, or the way we know Taliban today, it can directly be connected with the intervention of Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Because when Soviet troops intervened in Afghanistan back in the year 1979, people in Afghanistan and even in different parts of the world, particularly the Muslim world, they started considering it to be compulsory or obligatory for all of them, or for many of them, to get into war against infidels. This brought many people belonging to different parts of the world to this land of Afghanistan, and they started struggling against foreign intruders, against Soviets. Here, of course, Afghans themselves had given tough resistance to Soviet troops, and their struggle ultimately pushed Soviet troops out of Afghanistan. But during this decade, when these Afghans were struggling against Soviet troops, we could see that different kinds of mujahideen were in workplace, and they had been struggling, they had been fighting for different causes. And these were not only the local Afghans, even many other countries had their own stakes in Afghanistan, and so they also got indulged either directly by sending their people or by providing training to Afghans or Afghan mujahideens or the Afghan refugees like Pakistan or even Iran. However, there are many others who kept backing Afghan people by sending military assistance or even economic packages, and they included, means on the top of the list we see United States of America, the Cold War rival of Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia, who also was inclined to support Sunni groups here in Afghanistan against the infidels. And again, means there were, since different groups were fighting against Soviet Union here, but Saudis were focused on particular groups. So with the Soviet withdrawal, a new regime was being brought in, was being established in Afghanistan, being headed by the man, this Professor Dr. Najibullah. So Dr. Najibullah somehow represented a socialist government here in Afghanistan. An international community, after successful signing of Geneva Accords among different factions and different parties, was hoping a more stable Afghanistan. However, unfortunately, this was not the case. Professor Najibullah could not stay here for long, and he had to face tough resistance by different factions, being backed by different foreign countries as well. So Professor Najibullah could not deal with the kind of chaos that existed, and ultimately his regime was toppled in the year 1992, and later on he was being persecuted. So as soon as the regime was toppled, Afghanistan got into, unrest was already prevailing, but civil war, proper civil war started, and it continued then for the next many years. Now, when Najibullah was being toppled or his regime was being removed, much of the Afghanistan, which was still unstable, got into the hands of organized and united Tajik forces of Burhanuddin Rabbani and his military commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who at some later stages even turned against Burhanuddin Rabbani himself, and even to the Uzbek forces from the north under General Rashid Dostam. So Afghanistan, where a lot of ethnic communities were residing, the majority among them, of course, was of Pashtuns, and it was after closer to 300 years when Pashtuns were not ruling Afghanistan and non-Pashtuns were able to exert control over Afghanistan. However, things didn't get stable, and Afghanistan had been in a civil war, and this civil war obviously continued. Here, a Pashtun leader, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, also attempted to rally these Pashtuns and laid siege to Kabul as well. Now, the country got divided among different warlords, and more than 6 different groups had been able to exert control over different parts of Afghanistan. So in this map, you can easily see how during this whole phase after 1989, Afghanistan was ethnically divided and politically divided among different groups and among different political parties. So since obviously different warlords had taken over Afghanistan, there was a power vacuum. And the power vacuum increased primarily because in 1994, all the traditional leaders of Afghanistan got vanished, or they somehow were no more visible. Plundering, robbing, kidnapping, and fighting were common practices. So there were those who started thinking to bring some change and who got motivated to somehow to do something for the Afghan people. And most of them actually were the Mujahideen, who initially did not have any interest in grabbing political power. But now, by looking at the fragile situation of Afghanistan and the kind of malpractices being carried by different people, they consider it to be their duty to do something for the people of Afghanistan. And here we see actually the emergence of Taliban, because all those Mujahideen, after fighting Najibullah and his regime, had either gone home or continued their studies at madrasas, both in Quetta and Kandahar. And they initially thought things will be in order now, but they had been deeply concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation of Afghanistan. So by looking at this situation, they started holding meetings to formulate a strategy to help their countrymen. And in order to pursue this cause, many from Quetta also moved to Kandahar, where they were able to meet a person named as Mullah Omar, whom they started considering to be the born leader for their movement, which they started calling to be Taliban. So they met him and they started coming up with different opinions to find out or to somehow come up with a comprehensive plan. They had an agenda to follow, which was based on the following 4 points. One was to restore peace in Afghanistan, then to disarm the population. Third one is to enforce Sharia law. And the last but not the least was to defend the integrity and Islamic character of Afghanistan. And this is what these Taliban claim to believe in even today. In the words of Mullah Omar, he actually came up with this statement by talking to a Pakistani journalist, Rahimullah Yusuf Zaivans. He said, we took up arms to achieve the aims of the Afghan jihad and save our people from further suffering at the hands of the so-called Mujahideen. We had complete faith in God Almighty. We never forgot that. He can bless us with victory or plunge us into defeat. So with this hope, they emerged on the scene. Now, who exactly they were, this we would be looking at via this slide. A Talib actually is an Islamic student. It's a term which is used to define an Islamic student who seeks knowledge, not to the mullahs who give knowledge. So by choosing such a name, the Taliban is the plural of the word Talib, they tried to distance themselves from the party politics of the Mujahideen, who had been, as I told you, different Mujahideen had been fighting against Soviet troops and then against Najib's regime. However, they did not want to associate themselves with that old cadre of Mujahideen. And they signaled that they were a movement for cleansing society, not a party trying to grab power. All those who gathered around Mullah Omar were the children of the jihad, but deeply disillusioned with the factionalism and criminal activities of the once idealized Mujahideen leadership, because they were not satisfied with the kind of objectives these Mujahideen had been trying to find out. These Taliban saw themselves as purifiers of a social system that had gone wrong and an Islamic way of life that had largely been compromised by corruption prevailing in Afghanistan. Many of these Taliban had been born in Pakistani refugee camps, educated in Pakistani madrasas, and had learnt their fighting skills from Mujahideen parties based in Pakistan. And that is why international community kept believing that Pakistan got influential position regarding Taliban, or they can easily persuade them to do something and not to do something and all that. However, related to Taliban, of course, we have a lot of myths, and there are some other things that we find to be closer to reality. And we have to dig them in our upcoming episodes. So in order to address the question, how Taliban rose to power, you'll have to watch our next episode, Taliban's rise to power in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned and wait for our next episodes to get the answers of all the questions that you probably would be having in your minds. Thank you. Stay blessed.